He wasn't supposed to hear that sound again. Not after 37 nights of silence. Not after every officer had stopped knocking. Not after hope had thinned into something quieter than grief. But there it was, a slow, deliberate scratch against the glass. Daniel Hayes sat frozen in the dim light of his living room, the only glow coming from a lamp he hadn't turned off in weeks, as if darkness might erase what little remained of her. The house still smelled faintly of lavender and crayons, of a life paused mid-sentence. Lily's shoes were still by the door. Her cereal bowl still sat in the sink. A faint ring of milk dried along the edge like time had simply forgotten to move forward. The clock on the wall ticked too loud, each second landing like a question no one could answer. 2:17 a.m. It had been 2:17 the night she vanished. The same minute he woke to a silence so complete it felt wrong, like the world had taken a breath and never let it go. Daniel's chest tightened as the sound came again. Scratch. Not frantic. Not desperate. Intentional. Measured. He turned his head slowly toward the window, muscles stiff, the way they used to be on patrol when instinct whispered before danger showed its face. Outside, the night stretched still and cold across the yard, a thin layer of frost clinging to the grass under a pale Missouri moon. And there, just beyond the reflection of his own tired eyes in the glass, stood the dog. A German shepherd. Tall, lean, motionless. Its coat caught the moonlight in muted shades of sable and shadow, and its amber eyes, they didn't glow like an animal's should in the dark. They watched, calm, steady, waiting. Daniel didn't move. His breath slowed, controlled, like muscle memory kicking in from a life he no longer lived but never truly left behind. There was something wrong about the stillness. Stray dogs didn't stand like that. They paced. They sniffed. They searched for food, for warmth, for anything that might keep them alive one more night. This one, it held its ground like it had a purpose, like it had already found what it came for. The dog lifted its head slightly, just enough to break the perfect line of its silhouette, and for a moment, Daniel felt something shift in the air between them. Not fear, not comfort, recognition, the kind that doesn't belong to strangers. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, eyes narrowing as if clarity might come if he looked long enough. Go on, he muttered under his breath, voice rough from disuse. Get out of here. The words barely made it past the glass. The dog didn't flinch, didn't blink. It simply turned its head a fraction toward the dark line of trees beyond the yard, then back to him. A gesture so small it could have been nothing. But Daniel felt it land somewhere deeper than logic. The wind stirred faintly, brushing against the side of the house with a hollow whisper, carrying the distant scent of pine and cold earth. For a second, just a second, he thought he heard something else beneath it. A memory. A voice. Light. Fragile. Dad. His heart slammed once, hard enough to hurt. He stepped closer to the window before he could stop himself, boots silent against the wooden floor. The dog didn't retreat. It waited. Always waiting. And then, slowly, it stepped back. Not away. Not fleeing. Just creating space. As if leaving room for him to choose. Daniel's hand hovered near the door handle, fingers trembling in a way that had nothing to do with fear. 37 days of nothing. 37 nights of unanswered questions, of empty roads and colder mornings. And now this. A dog that didn't belong. A sound that shouldn't be. A moment that felt too precise to be chance. He exhaled, long and quiet, the kind of breath a man takes before stepping into something he can't come back from unchanged. Outside, the German shepherd turned its body slightly, angling toward the trees again, then paused, just long enough to look back one more time. Not pleading, not commanding, just certain. And somehow, that certainty was louder than any search party, any radio call, any promise that things would make sense again. Daniel opened the door. The cold hit him first, a thin blade of air sliding under his collar as he stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking softly beneath his weight, a sound that felt too loud for the hour, too real for something that already felt unreal, and yet the dog did not react to it, did not startle, did not turn with the jittery caution of a stray. It simply stood at the edge of the yard, its body angled toward the tree line as if the darkness itself had called its name, and it had answered without question. And for a moment Daniel hesitated, one hand still resting against the door behind him, feeling the warmth of the house pressing faintly against his palm like the last piece of a life he understood, a life where doors closed and things stayed inside, and children slept safely down the hall. But that world had already slipped through his fingers 37 nights ago, leaving behind only questions and the quiet ache of absence. So he let the door drift shut behind him without looking back, the soft click sounding final in a way he did not want to examine. And when he looked forward again, the dog had taken a few slow steps into the yard, not rushing, not urging, just moving with that same deliberate certainty that made something tighten in his chest, and Daniel followed, boots pressing into the frost-damp grass, each step careful, measured, the way he used to move through unfamiliar terrain when every shadow might mean something, when every sound mattered, and the night answered him with silence. A wide-open stillness broken only by the distant hum of a highway miles away and the faint rustle of wind through bare branches, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth and something else he could not name but felt he should recognize. The dog paused near the old fence line where the yard gave way to a narrow trail leading into the woods, a trail Daniel had walked 100 times with Lily on brighter days when her laughter had filled the air and turned even the smallest path into an adventure. And the memory came without warning, sharp and sudden, her small hand wrapped around his finger, her voice asking questions he had pretended to know the answers to. And for a second his vision blurred, not from tears but from the weight of it pressing in all at once. And he almost called out her name, almost broke whatever fragile thread was holding this moment together. But the dog shifted again, just enough to pull his focus back, its ears flicking once as if catching a signal too faint for human senses. And then it stepped onto the trail, disappearing halfway into the shadow before stopping and looking back, always making sure he was still there. And that was the thing that unsettled him most, not the silence, not the hour, not even the way this felt like stepping into something he could not explain, but the way the dog moved like it knew him, like it trusted him to follow, like this was not the first time they had walked side by side toward something unknown. Daniel exhaled slowly, feeling the familiar shift inside his chest as instinct overrode hesitation, the part of him that had once made decisions in seconds without needing to understand every outcome rising quietly to the surface. And he stepped onto the trail, the ground softer here, the frost giving way to damp soil that muted his footsteps, the trees closing in around him in tall dark lines that blocked out what little light the moon offered, turning the world into shades of gray and shadow. And ahead of him the German shepherd moved with a steady rhythm, not fast, not slow, its body low but not tense, as if following a path already set long before this night began. And Daniel found himself matching that rhythm, his breathing evening out, his senses sharpening, noticing things he would have missed weeks ago, a broken twig off to the side, a faint indentation in the earth that might have been a footprint or might have been nothing at all, the slight shift in the air where the wind changed direction, and somewhere beneath it all a feeling he could not shake. Not fear, not hope, something in between, something that felt like being led, not by command but by trust. And as the trail curved deeper into the woods, the house behind him fading into memory, Daniel realized with a quiet, steady certainty that this was no longer about chance, no longer about coincidence, because the dog did not wander, it did not search, it did not hesitate, it knew exactly where it was going. And somehow, without a single word spoken, it expected him to know that too. The deeper they moved into the woods, the quieter the world became, not the natural quiet of a sleeping forest, but something heavier, as if the air itself had chosen to hold its breath, and Daniel felt it settle into his bones with every step. A silence that pressed against his ears until even the faint rhythm of his own heartbeat sounded louder than it should. And ahead of him the German shepherd continued without hesitation, weaving between the trees with a precision that felt practiced, intentional, as though this path was not being discovered but remembered. And that thought lingered in Daniel's mind longer than it should have, because memory belonged to those who had lived something before, and this dog, it carried itself like it had, like it knew not just the ground beneath its paws but the reason it was walking it. And Daniel found himself watching more closely now, not just following but studying, the way he had been trained to do, noticing the subtle shifts in the dog's posture, the way its ears flicked toward sounds too distant for him to hear, the way it slowed at certain points, not to rest, but to confirm, to check, as if aligning itself with something unseen. And then it happened, small enough that another man might have missed it, but Daniel did not. A scrap of pale fabric caught on a low branch just off the trail, barely visible in the dim light, swaying slightly with the movement of the air, and he stopped, his breath catching in his throat as his eyes locked onto it. The world narrowing to that single detail, that single possibility, and slowly he stepped closer, reaching out with a hand that did not feel entirely steady. The fabric soft between his fingers, worn at the edges, familiar in a way that made his chest tighten painfully, and he did not need light to know it, did not need confirmation beyond what his heart had already recognized. It was from her jacket, the small blue one she had worn the day before she disappeared, the one with the loose thread near the sleeve she had asked him to fix, and he had said he would get to later, and later had never come, not in the way it was supposed to. And for a moment the forest seemed to tilt around him, memory crashing into the present. With a force he could not control, Lily standing by the door, tugging at that very sleeve, smiling up at him with a patience that only children carry, and then gone, just gone, leaving behind nothing but questions and the echo of her voice in rooms that had grown too quiet. Daniel closed his hand around the fabric, holding it tighter than necessary, as if it might slip away if he did not. And when he looked up again, the dog had stopped several yards ahead, watching him, not impatient, not urging, simply waiting, always waiting, as though this moment had been expected, as though it understood what that small piece of cloth meant in a way words could not explain. And Daniel took a slow breath, forcing himself back into the present, back into the movement, because this was no longer just a search driven by desperation. This was a trail, a real one, marked not by guesswork, but by something deliberate, something that had been left behind, and the realization settled into him with a quiet, steady weight. Whoever had taken her had not been careful enough, or perhaps they had not expected someone like him to follow, someone trained to read what others overlooked. And yet, it was not him who had found it first. It was the dog, and that truth lingered in the back of his mind, unsettling and grounding all at once, because it meant he was not alone in this, not entirely. And as he stepped forward again, passing the place where the fabric had caught, he noticed more now, things that had been invisible before, a faint drag mark along the side of the trail where the ground had been disturbed just enough to break its natural pattern, a shallow impression that might have been a footprint, not clear, not defined, but present. And the dog moved ahead once more, adjusting its path slightly, guiding him not in a straight line, but along a route that seemed to connect these scattered signs into something whole, something leading somewhere. And Daniel followed without question now, the hesitation from before gone, replaced by a focus that sharpened with every step, the old instincts settling back into place like they had never left. And yet beneath that focus there was something else, something quieter, something he could not name but felt with increasing certainty, the sense that this was more than tracking, more than chance alignment of clues, the sense that he was being shown the way, not just by the signs on the ground, but by the presence moving ahead of him, silent, steady, unwavering. And as the trees began to thin slightly, the darkness shifting just enough to reveal a deeper stretch of land beyond, Daniel felt it again, that same pull in his chest, that same fragile echo carried on the wind, not loud, not clear, but unmistakable in its familiarity, a voice he would have recognized anywhere. And though it did not form words, though it barely existed beyond the edges of his perception, it was enough to make him take one more step, and then another, following the dog, into whatever waited beyond the next line of trees. The trees began to open just enough to let a faint wash of moonlight spill across the ground, turning the forest floor into a patchwork of pale silver and shadow, and Daniel slowed without realizing it, his senses sharpening further as the space ahead shifted from dense cover into something wider, something that felt used, not recently, not obviously, but enough that the natural rhythm of untouched land had been interrupted at some point, and the German shepherd eased its pace as well, not stopping, never fully stopping, but adjusting in a way that suggested awareness, like it had crossed this threshold before and understood what waited beyond it. And Daniel noticed the change immediately, the subtle tension in the air, the way the wind seemed to move differently here, less wild, more contained, as if the trees themselves had grown used to holding secrets. And then he saw it, barely visible at first. A faint outline through the branches ahead, straight lines where there should have been none, angles that did not belong to nature, and his chest tightened as recognition settled in before clarity did. A structure, old, quiet, hidden just far enough off any known path that it would not be stumbled upon by accident. And the dog stopped at the edge of the clearing, its body still, its head slightly lowered, not in fear but in focus, and Daniel stepped up beside it, his breath steady but deeper now, each inhale carrying the scent of damp wood and something older, something abandoned. And as he moved forward, the shape resolved into a small cabin, weathered by years. Its wood faded to a gray that blended into the trees, windows dark, roof sagging just enough to suggest time had taken more than it had given back. And for a moment the world narrowed again, not to a single detail this time, but to the entire scene before him. Because this was not random, this was not chance, this was a destination, and the realization settled heavy in his chest, grounding and terrifying all at once. And the dog did not move toward the cabin, did not rush ahead or circle it the way a curious animal might. It remained where it was, watching, waiting, as if this part was no longer its role, as if it had brought him exactly where he needed to be, and now the next step belonged to him alone. Daniel swallowed, his eyes scanning the perimeter the way they had been trained to do, noting the broken fence post off to the side, the faint track where something heavy had once been dragged or carried across the ground, the slight indentation near the door where footsteps might have pressed into softer soil before hardening over time. And then he saw it again, another piece of fabric, smaller this time, caught near the base of the porch step, and his heart gave a sharp, painful beat as he approached, crouching slowly, the world around him falling away into silence as his fingers reached for it. The material damp from the night air, but unmistakable. Another piece of Lily's jacket, and this time there was no hesitation, no doubt, just a quiet, undeniable truth settling into place. She had been here, not imagined, not hoped for, but real, tangible, leaving pieces of her path behind like echoes he was only now learning to hear. And Daniel rose, his gaze lifting to the cabin door, closed but not sealed, a narrow gap visible along the frame where the wood had warped over time. And for a moment he stood there, not frozen, not afraid, but aware in a way that felt almost sacred, as if stepping forward would shift something irreversible, as if the line between not knowing and knowing lay just a few feet ahead, and behind him the German shepherd remained silent, its presence steady, unintrusive, and yet Daniel could feel it, could feel the weight of that quiet watchfulness, not pushing, not guiding anymore, simply there. And that was when it struck him, not as a thought, but as a realization that settled deep and certain. The dog had not come to save her. It had come to find him, to bring him here, to this exact place at this exact moment. And whatever happened next, it was his to face, his to understand, and his to carry. And Daniel took a slow breath, steadying himself, his hand lifting toward the cabin door as the night held its silence around him, waiting. The wood of the door felt colder than it should have under his hand, as if it had been holding on to the night longer than the air around it. And Daniel paused there for just a second, fingers resting against the worn surface, listening, not just with his ears, but with something deeper, something that had been sharpened by years of learning when to move and when to wait. And the silence on the other side was not empty. It carried a weight, a presence, faint but undeniable, like a room that had not forgotten the people who had passed through it. And slowly he pushed the door inward, the hinges giving a soft, tired creak that seemed too loud in the stillness. And the darkness inside shifted as the door opened, revealing the outline of a small, single room, the air thick with the scent of aged wood and dust, untouched for long enough that time itself felt suspended within it. And Daniel stepped across the threshold carefully, his boots landing with muted thuds against the wooden floor. Each step deliberate, measured, his eyes adjusting quickly, scanning every corner, every surface, noting the broken chair against the far wall, the old table with one leg uneven, the narrow window that let in just enough moonlight to paint faint shapes across the interior. And then he saw it, not immediately, not as something obvious, but as something out of place. A small object resting near the edge of the room where the floor met the wall, and his breath slowed as he moved closer, crouching down, the world narrowing once more to a single point of focus. And there it was, a small sneaker, light-colored, with a worn sole and a loose lace trailing off to the side, and his chest tightened so sharply he had to steady himself with one hand against the floor, because he knew it, recognized every detail without needing to question it. Lily's. And for a moment the room seemed to close in around him, not in fear but in the overwhelming certainty that he was no longer chasing a shadow. He was standing inside her last known place, and he reached out slowly, picking up the shoe with a care that felt almost reverent, his thumb brushing lightly against the fabric as if expecting warmth that was no longer there. And he closed his eyes briefly, just long enough to let the truth settle without breaking him. And when he opened them again, something had changed, not outside, not in the room, but inside him. The hesitation that had followed him through the woods was gone, replaced by something steadier, something that did not question whether he should be here, but simply accepted that he was. And he rose to his feet, his gaze moving again across the space with renewed clarity, searching not just for signs but for direction, for meaning, for anything that could tell him where the trail continued. And then he noticed it, a faint line of scuffed floorboards leading toward the back corner of the cabin, subtle, easy to miss if you were not looking for it, but once seen it could not be unseen, and he followed it, each step careful, his breathing controlled, until he reached the corner where the wall met a narrow section of floor that looked no different at first glance, and yet something about it felt wrong, slightly raised, slightly misaligned, and Daniel knelt again, setting the shoe gently beside him as his fingers traced along the edge of the boards, feeling for any irregularity, any shift in the wood that might reveal what his eyes could not. And then he found it, a small gap, just enough to slip his fingers into, and he pulled upward slowly, the board lifting with a soft resistance before giving way, revealing a shallow space beneath, and inside, tucked carefully as if placed with intention, was a small object wrapped in a piece of cloth, and Daniel's hands paused for a fraction of a second before reaching in, lifting it out with a steadiness that came not from calm but from purpose. And as he unwrapped the cloth, the moonlight caught on something metallic, something worn but unmistakable, a dog tag, its surface scratched by time, but still bearing the faint engraving of a name, and Daniel's eyes narrowed as he turned it slightly, reading the letters. Slowly, each one settling into place with a weight that felt heavier than it should, a Marine's name, one he did not recognize, not immediately, but the presence of it here, hidden beneath the floor of an abandoned cabin, tied to the trail that had led him to his daughter's last known place, was not something that could be dismissed, and for a moment he simply held it there, the cool metal resting against his palm, the silence of the cabin pressing in around him, and then, from outside, faint, but clear enough to reach him through the open door, came the soft sound of movement, not random, not distant, but close, and Daniel's head lifted slightly, his focus shifting without losing its edge, because whatever this place had been, whatever had happened here, it was not finished speaking yet. Daniel did not move at first, his hand still wrapped around the cold edge of the dog tag, the thin chain slipping slightly between his fingers as the sound outside came again, softer this time, but closer, deliberate in a way that matched something he had already learned to recognize, and slowly he rose from where he knelt, leaving the floorboards slightly ajar behind him. The hidden space no longer as important as the presence waiting beyond the door, and he stepped carefully across the cabin. Each footfall measured, controlled, his breathing steady despite the quiet tension building in his chest. And when he reached the doorway, he stopped just inside the threshold, letting his eyes adjust to the contrast between the dim interior and the pale wash of moonlight outside. And there it was, the German Shepherd, standing exactly where he had left it, unmoved, unwavering, its silhouette framed against the clearing like something carved from shadow and light. And for a moment nothing happened, no sound, no movement, just the two of them existing in that narrow space between question and answer. And then the dog shifted its weight slightly, not stepping forward, not retreating, just enough to draw his attention again toward the far side of the clearing, toward a line of trees he had not noticed before, darker than the rest, thicker, as if hiding something beyond them, and Daniel's gaze followed that direction instinctively, the old part of his mind already mapping distance. terrain, possibility. And when he looked back, the dog was already turning, not waiting this time, not pausing for him to decide, but moving with quiet purpose toward that unseen point. And something in Daniel tightened, not hesitation, but urgency, because this felt different, not like before where each step had been offered as a choice. This felt like a narrowing, like the window was closing and whatever lay ahead would not wait forever. And he stepped out into the cold again without thinking, the dog tag still clutched in his hand, its edges pressing faintly into his skin as if grounding him in the reality of what he had found. And he followed, crossing the clearing quickly now, his boots brushing over frost and brittle grass, the cabin fading behind him as the dog led him toward the thicker part of the woods. And as they moved, the air changed again, cooler, heavier, carrying a faint scent of water this time, damp earth mixed with something metallic, something still and quiet. And Daniel noticed it immediately, the way the ground softened slightly beneath his feet, the subtle downward slope of the terrain. And then he heard it, faint but steady, the sound of water moving slowly somewhere ahead, not a river, not wide or rushing, but something smaller, a creek perhaps, hidden just beyond the next line of trees. And the dog did not slow. It moved straight toward that sound, weaving through the trunks with that same deliberate certainty. And Daniel followed closely now, no longer studying every detail, no longer questioning the path, because the pieces were aligning too clearly to ignore. The fabric, the cabin, the shoe, the hidden tag, and now this, a natural boundary, a place where someone might pause, might change direction, might leave behind another sign. And as they broke through the last of the trees, the ground opened slightly into a narrow stretch of land where the creek cut through the forest, its surface reflecting the moon in broken fragments as it moved over rocks and shallow bends. And the dog stopped at the edge of the water, its posture shifting for the first time into something that resembled tension, not fear, but focus sharpened into stillness. And Daniel stepped up beside it, his eyes scanning the area quickly, taking in the bank on the opposite side, the scattered stones, the faint impressions along the muddy edge where something had disturbed the surface not long ago. And then he saw it, just across the creek, partially hidden near a fallen log. Another piece of fabric, brighter than the others, catching the moonlight in a way that made it impossible to miss once his eyes found it. And his breath caught, not from surprise but from the quiet confirmation of what he already knew. The trail had not ended, it had only paused. And he looked down at the water, then back at the dog. And for the first time since this began, the animal met his gaze directly, holding it for a fraction longer than before, as if acknowledging something unspoken, as if confirming that the next step would change everything. And then it turned its head slightly toward the far bank again, waiting, not to lead this time, but to see if he would cross. Daniel did not hesitate this time, not because he was unafraid, but because something inside him had already crossed long before his body did. And he stepped forward into the creek, the cold water pressing instantly through the worn soles of his boots, rising around his ankles in a sharp, biting embrace that grounded him in the present, in the reality of where he stood and what lay ahead. And the current was gentle but steady, moving around the rocks in soft, persistent whispers that filled the silence just enough to remind him that time had not stopped, even if his world had tried to. And he moved carefully, placing each step with intention, the way he had been trained to cross uncertain terrain, feeling for stability before shifting his weight, the dog remaining on the near bank, watching, not following, not guiding, simply present. And that alone told him everything he needed to know. This part was his to do alone. And when he reached the other side, pulling himself up onto the damp earth, the ground softer here, marked with faint impressions that had not yet been erased by time or weather, his breath slowed again, controlled, focused, as he straightened and looked toward the piece of fabric ahead, the small strip of color against the muted tones of the forest. And he approached it slowly, every sense tuned to the details around him, the way the ground dipped slightly near the fallen log, the way the branches above had been disturbed just enough to suggest something had passed through recently, not hours ago, not days, but within a window that still felt close enough to matter. And when he reached the fabric, he crouched, lifting it gently, his fingers tracing the edge as recognition settled in without resistance. Another piece of Lily's jacket, torn but not lost, left behind like a quiet signal. And this time he did not close his eyes, did not allow himself to drift into memory, because the present was speaking too clearly to ignore, and he turned his head slightly, scanning the area beyond the log, and that was when he saw it, not immediately, not in full, but in fragments, a shape deeper in the trees, lower to the ground, partially obscured by brush, and he rose slowly, his body shifting into a posture that balanced urgency with control, and he moved forward, one step at a time, the distance closing in a way that felt both too fast and not fast enough. And then the shape resolved, not into something threatening, not into something unknown, but into something heartbreakingly familiar. A small figure curled against the base of a tree, wrapped in the quiet stillness of the forest, and Daniel's breath caught in his chest, not in panic, not in fear, but in the overwhelming weight of recognition. And for a second he could not move, could not speak, could only stand there as the distance between what he had feared and what was real collapsed into a single moment. And then he stepped forward quickly, dropping to his knees beside her, his hands moving carefully, gently, as if afraid that even the slightest force might break the fragile reality of her presence. "Lily," he said, his voice low, steady despite the tremor beneath it, and her eyes opened slowly, not in shock, not in fear, but in a quiet, tired recognition, as if she had been waiting, not for rescue, but for him, and she shifted slightly, her small hand reaching toward him without hesitation, and he took it immediately, holding it firmly but gently, grounding her, grounding himself. And for a moment the world narrowed again, not to fear, not to uncertainty, but to the simple, undeniable truth that she was here, that she was real, that she was not lost to him. And the forest around them remained silent, the creek still moving behind him, the night holding its breath as if honoring the fragile miracle unfolding within it. And as Daniel gathered her carefully into his arms, feeling the warmth of her against him, the steady rhythm of her breathing, he allowed himself, for the first time in 37 nights, to believe that this was not the end of something, but the beginning of everything returning. Daniel held her a little tighter than necessary, as if the forest might change its mind and take her back if he loosened his grip, his hand resting gently against the back of her head, fingers brushing through her hair with a care that felt almost unfamiliar after weeks of emptiness. And Lily did not pull away, she leaned into him instead, her small frame pressing against his chest, as if she had known all along that this moment would come. And for a while neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because words felt too small for what had just been given back to them. And the only sound was the quiet movement of the creek behind them and the faint rustle of leaves overhead, the kind of silence that did not feel empty anymore, but full, steady, alive. And when Daniel finally eased back just enough to look at her, his hands still resting on her shoulders, his eyes searching her face with a careful urgency, she met his gaze with a calm that did not belong to fear. And that alone made something shift inside him, something he could not fully understand. "Are you hurt?" he asked softly, his voice steady but lower than before, and she shook her head, a small, slow movement, her eyes clear despite the tiredness behind them. And then she looked past him, just over his shoulder, and Daniel followed that gaze instinctively, turning slightly, expecting to see nothing more than the dark trees and the path he had taken. But instead he saw it again, the German shepherd, standing at the edge of the clearing on the far side of the creek, exactly where it had been before, as if it had never moved, as if time had passed only for him. And Lily's fingers tightened slightly around his sleeve, not in fear, but in recognition. "He stayed with me," she said quietly, her voice soft but certain, and Daniel looked back at her, his brow tightening slightly, not from doubt, but from the weight of what that meant. "He found me when it got dark," she continued, her eyes drifting again toward the dog. "He did not come close, he just stayed, like he was waiting for you." And Daniel's chest tightened again, not painfully this time, but with something deeper, something that settled slowly into place, and he turned back once more, his gaze locking onto the dog across the water. And for a moment everything felt suspended, the distance between them not just measured in feet, but in something harder to define, something that stretched beyond the present moment into something older, something that had begun long before this night. and the dog did not move, did not step forward or retreat. It simply stood there, its posture calm, its presence steady, and Daniel felt it then, not as a thought, not as a conclusion, but as a quiet understanding that did not need explanation, that whatever this animal was, whatever had guided it here, its purpose had never been to stay, only to lead, only to bring him to this exact place, at this exact time. And now that it had, there was nothing left for it to do, and he swallowed slowly, his hand instinctively tightening around the dog tag still resting in his palm, the metal cool and solid, a reminder that some stories did not begin where we thought they did, and did not end where we expected them to. And as he shifted his weight slightly, helping Lily stand, her small hand still wrapped in his, he glanced back one more time, just long enough to make sure he had not imagined it, just long enough to hold that silent connection for one final second. But the space where the dog had been was empty now, not disturbed, not broken, just still, as if it had never been there at all, and yet the path it had left behind remained, clear and undeniable, leading him not just to his daughter, but to something he knew he would carry long after this night had passed. The walk back felt different, not shorter, not easier, but steadier, as if the forest itself had shifted its weight to make room for them to pass. And Daniel kept one arm around Lily the entire way, his hand resting lightly against her shoulder, not guiding, not pulling, just there, a quiet reassurance that neither of them needed to question, and she stayed close without resistance, her small steps matching his, her fingers occasionally tightening around his sleeve whenever the ground dipped or the shadows thickened, and each time he felt it, he adjusted without thinking, slowing slightly, angling his body just enough to shield her from branches or uneven ground, the instinct returning not as something learned, but as something remembered, something that had never truly left. And when they reached the creek again, he did not pause this time. He stepped into the water with the same care as before, lifting her easily into his arms as the cold current pressed around his legs, and she rested against him without protest, her head leaning lightly against his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck. And for a moment, just a moment, the world felt simple again, reduced to the rhythm of movement, the sound of water, the quiet certainty of holding on to what mattered most. And when they reached the other side, he set her down gently, his hand lingering at her back just long enough to make sure she was steady. And then they continued, retracing the path through the trees, past the places where the signs had once been clues and were now simply memories of how they had found each other again. And Daniel noticed them differently now. The broken branch, the disturbed earth, the faint trail that had led him forward. They no longer carried urgency, only meaning, each one a step in something that had already been completed. And as the cabin came back into view through the trees, he slowed slightly, not out of caution, but out of awareness, because this place, quiet and worn and hidden, was no longer just a point on a map. It was part of the story now, part of something that had changed him in ways he would not fully understand until much later. And he stepped into the clearing with Lily beside him, his eyes moving instinctively toward the doorway, half expecting to see something different, something altered. But the cabin remained exactly as it had been, still, silent, holding its secrets without explanation. And for a moment, he considered going back inside, retrieving the dog tag he had found, tracing its meaning further. But something stopped him, not hesitation, not fear, but a quiet sense that whatever answers it held were not meant to be uncovered tonight, that some things were given in pieces, not all at once. And he reached into his pocket instead, his fingers brushing against the metal he had already taken, the weight of it grounding him again. And he glanced down at Lily, who looked up at him with a softness that had not been there before, not because she was changed, but because something between them had been restored, something that had been missing without either of them understanding how deeply it mattered until now. And without a word, they turned away from the cabin, leaving it behind as they moved back toward the path that would lead them home. The trees opening slowly as the distance grew, the faint outline of the yard beginning to take shape ahead, and the house, their house, standing quiet and waiting at the edge of the forest like it had been holding its breath for their return. And when they reached the porch, Daniel paused for just a second, his hand resting on the door as it had been before. But this time the feeling was different, not hesitation, not uncertainty, but gratitude, quiet and steady, and he opened it, letting the warmth spill out into the night as Lily stepped inside first, her small figure crossing the threshold with a familiarity that felt like a promise, and Daniel followed, closing the door gently behind them, the sound soft but final in a different way. Now, not an ending, but a beginning, and later, much later, when the house had settled into sleep and the world outside had returned to its quiet rhythm, Daniel stood by the window once more, the same place where it had all begun, his gaze drifting out toward the edge of the trees, half expecting, half hoping. But the yard remained empty, still and untouched, and yet as he looked down, just near the base of the window, he noticed something he had not seen before, a single set of paw prints, pressed lightly into the frost, clear and deliberate, leading up to the glass and stopping there, with no sign of where they had gone after, and Daniel's breath slowed as he studied them, not searching for answers this time, not questioning what could not be explained, but simply accepting what had been given, and he rested his hand lightly against the glass, his voice barely more than a whisper as it slipped into the quiet of the room. "Thank you." And for a moment, just a moment, the night seemed to hold that word, carrying it somewhere beyond sight, beyond understanding, into a place where some stories do not end, they simply become something else.